Hi, welcome to my channel. I'm Snappy Dragon. Here we do stitchy business, and in this video we are going to take on a 3-in-1 pattern drafting, fitting, and medical challenge, making a Victorian corset that doesn't upset my health issues. Also, I'm excited to announce my channel's participation in CocoVid, a costume-wide online conference taking place July 30th through August 2nd. I'll be doing 2 live videos on this channel, one with some very special guests. Stick around to hear more about it, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss those videos when they come out. Please pardon the tape all over my shoulder. You'll also have to stick around to hear about that. I took part in a big Victorian-era festival this past year. It's a lot like a Renaissance fair, and most participants create their own costumes. A corset is necessary to get the right foundation under the dress, plus if they do their job, they support your bust, your back, and the weight of the gigantic skirts. I was quite new to costuming and not up for sewing one, so I bought one. But I have some health problems which did not get on with this particular corset and costume, and I was in a lot of pain the entire run of the festival. I'm not faulting the makers of this corset at all. There is nothing wrong with it. I bought the CS411 model from Orchard Corset, who make modern corsets of some very impressive quality. This is serious, real corsetry, not some cheap fabric tube with bones and a busk slapped on. If you have a budget of $100 and you need a corset that's actually worth having, I think they're your best bet. If this had been a good fit for me, I wouldn't be making this video. Corsets are intense garments and need to fit really, really well in order to be comfortable. My medical issues make me harder to fit and much more sensitive if the fit isn't perfect. Before talking about this, I do want to ask that folks please don't comment with any kind of medical advice. People with health issues get a lot of this advice when we haven't asked for it, and it's very tiring. I'm just here to make costumes, so unless it's about a corset, please don't make those suggestions no matter what. My audience seems to have really good manners, so I'm sure I have nothing to worry about. Perhaps you've seen Bernadette Banner's videos on corsets and scoliosis. Well, I also have scoliosis. There's a curve in my spine between my shoulder blades here. So my shoulders are different shapes, and my right shoulder blade sticks out a lot because my spine is in the way of where it should go. My spine also twists vertically, which means my shoulders and ribs and hips are rotated at angles from each other, and my whole body is a little asymmetrical. This makes me harder to fit, but what causes the most issues in costume is my fibromyalgia. Fibromyalgia, in short, is a poorly understood condition of the nerves and muscles that causes pain and fatigue, among other things. It's chronic, so there's no cure, although it can sometimes be managed or treated. It affects everyone who has it differently. For me, if you imagine the tightness and knots and burning, achy feeling you get if you exercise way too hard and don't stretch or anything, my muscles are like that all the time, to some level. I've had massage therapists who couldn't tell whether they were pressing on a knot in my shoulder or my actual shoulder bones. If clothing puts pressure on certain areas, it makes the pain and tightness much worse. For instance, I can't wear racer back straps. In my old corset, I would get really painful muscle spasms in my lower back, about a 6 or a 7 on a scale of 10. Wearing this for 10-hour days of singing and dancing and interacting with guests and being in that much pain? Not good. The festival is canceled this year because of the pandemic, but if I want to make any other Victorian outfits, which I do, I need a corset to fit over. How does this relate to CocoVid, you ask? And what even is CocoVid? Well, I am far from the only costumer who has health issues that affect how they take part in the costuming community, from making and wearing outfits to costuming in public and attending events. CocoVid is an independently organized, costume-wide online event to fill the void left by the saddening but necessary cancellation of Costume College this year. There will be all sorts of teaching-oriented videos going up, red carpet and Sunday Undies events over on Instagram, a Discord server to hang out in, and live panels as well. My channel will be hosting a panel on Friday, July 31st at 11 a.m. Pacific time on disability and health issues in the costuming community. Panelists will include myself, Bernadette Banner, Nikki from Liam, Yul Tyson, Gilbert of Dolthalion, Kate of Willoughby and Rose, Marty of Scraps and Sequins, Marlisa from Little Crocus, and Liz of Lizcapism as our moderator. There will be a live audience Q&A at the end, but if you aren't able to make the live stream, it'll stay up on this channel. I'll also be live streaming an 18th century pleating math demo, so keep an eye out for the schedule with info on that and many other amazing videos. And now we return to the actual subject of this video, creating a corset pattern that fits my very asymmetrical body and doesn't hurt when I'm wearing it. Rather than buying a pattern that gives hypothetical sizing info and having to grade and fuss and make a million mock-ups just to get it to be me-shaped, I decided to draft a pattern to my measurements. I found this drafting tutorial from the wise and excellent Madam Kathy Hay, who has been incredibly generous and made it freely available on the internet. However, like most patterns, this will make a symmetrical corset, and I need an asymmetrical one. Doing this starts with the measurements. The instructions say to measure the full circumference, front and back of your bust, waist, underbust, and high hip. I measured all of those things plus each quadrant of my body. For example, as well as a front bust measurement, I took measurements for the right and left side of my front bust. This way I could account for things like my right shoulder sticking out more than my left one, or my waist being straighter on one side than the other. It's important to note that when the tutorial says hip measurement, you need your high hip measured at your hip bones, not your full hip at the widest part of your lower body. Measurements were taken with much help from my roommate and advice from this video by Lucy's Corsetry. Once I had all of the measurements, I could draft out the pattern. I had to modify the instructions a bit to work with my asymmetrical measurements, but I'll talk more about that when I actually do the second draft. My first draft was done to my exact measurements with no waist reduction at all. So here's what those look like. There's right side and left side. There's one place where the pattern tells you to expect some overlap in these two pieces, but especially on the right side, I had a lot of overlap here. These pieces are not supposed to overlap, but I guess this is just what happens if you have very broad shoulder here. This is my shoulder that sticks out versus a narrow lower back, I suppose. So I traced those onto kitchen parchment. Please don't bite me. This is just what I had around right now. I've labeled all of the pieces with where in the corset they go, but also which side, because I don't want to get them confused and end up with a weird conglomeration. Once I had these, I traced them onto yet more brown paper, cut them out, and made a paper twirl, which isn't going to tell me perfect fit information, but it is going to tell me, one, I've made a functional pattern where all of the pieces fit together with each other, and two, I can hold this up to my body and make sure it's within an order of magnitude of being me-shaped, and it's not sticking out like crazy in places that I don't stick out. Here are the remains of my old corset, which I have pretty much scrapped for parts. So I took out the busk and all of the boning. I cut the grommets off the back to create lacing strips. I sewed this fit testing mock-up out of some plain cotton canvas using straight seams. I wanted to adjust for things like bust placement and hip springs, so I put in the busk and the lacing strips, but no boning yet. The bust area ended up needing to be taken in by 1/2 inch on the right side and more like 1 inch on the left side. I also added hip spring by taking out the seams on the side panels to the side front and side back panels below the waist. And instead of using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, I used the teeniest, tiniest zigzagged one I could. So that added around 1 inch of hip spring to each side. I put the unboned mock-up on and wore it for about an hour just to make sure that wasn't going to cause pain. It went fine. So then I slapped the scrappiest channels ever on the inside and added some very lightweight boning. There's some spiral salvage from the old corset. There's some flexible white plastic that I just had around, and started pain testing. I laced the mock-up with the standard 2-inch gap in the back and wore it around the house for about half an hour. Then I threw another t-shirt on and went for a walk around the neighborhood. 15 minutes in, I had no pain at all, so I laced the gap down to 1 inch, walked for another 25 minutes, then wore it for a while at home, and everything was fine, although it still didn't feel as tight as one would expect a corset to. The next day I put it on with a 1-inch gap while doing housework, and then tried lacing it with no gap. It was only after an hour of wearing it that tight that I began to feel some slight tension and pain in my lower back. Gave my muscles the rest of the day to relax, went back to a 1-inch gap the next day, and felt fine. Alright, so we know the limit. This corset should be about 1 inch smaller to maintain that 2-inch lacing gap without being so tight as to cause pain and no actual waist reduction. I needed a wearable mock-up with proper boning and bound edges so I could do a longer break-in and pain test. I'm redrafting the pattern to reflect the fitting changes, 1 inch smaller overall, but with the added hip spring and smaller bust cups. To distribute that inch size reduction evenly throughout the corset, I'm going to subtract 1/4 inch from each quadrant measurement as I use it, meaning a back left waist measurement of 6 1/4 inches will become 6 inches. The bust and hip adjustments will be done after. To show how all of the lines and points and formulas make a corset pattern, I'll draft each piece in a different color. This won't be a full walkthrough, but I hope it makes the drafting process easier to understand. The drafting process begins with cutting a large piece of paper according to the height and width of your corset. Kathy's instructions for that are quite straightforward. Then you begin drawing a sort of grid or framework, beginning with a vertical line for center front and horizontal lines at the height of the bust, underbust, waist, and high hip. Several more vertical lines are added, and this is where the proportion calculating begins. The tutorial supplies decimal fractions, and you multiply the relevant measurement on your body by the corresponding decimal to tell you where to place a point or a line. But remember, I'm making an asymmetrical corset, and my asymmetry isn't consistent on my body, so I'm using quadrant measurements. Kathy's math calculates proportions using either a full circumference measurement or the front or back half of the body. So in order to use the quadrant measurements I took, I had to multiply the decimals by either 4 when dealing with a full circumference measurement or 2 when dealing with a half circumference one. For instance, when I calculate where to place this point A, the back bust measurement is my right back bust measurement, and 0.22 becomes 0.44 because my right back bust is treated as half of my symmetrical back bust. To draft the pattern pieces, continue calculating proportions and placing points. As you mark out a set of points, the dots get connected and you'll begin to see pattern pieces emerge. There are several places my shape doesn't fit perfectly into the framework. The back piece overlaps the side back piece at the top, which is not intended to happen. It's not a problem because I'll be tracing these off, but it gives an idea of just how different the right side of my back is to my left. I think my right shoulder might actually need more room than my right breast, which I find hilarious. A similar thing goes on here because my waist to hip curve is much straighter on the right side, so instead of flaring out at the hip, this piece just slants to the side. Point is, don't be surprised if your pieces don't look like all the other corset pieces you've seen. Every body is different, and that's why you're drafting your own unique pattern. The tutorial includes 2 methods of drafting the bust, one for C cup and smaller, and one for larger busts. In bra sizes, I'm a double D cup, but since I'm such a small person, I have to use the A cup sizing on patterns or reduce the bust. So I'm using the smaller bust method, which creates a total of 5 pattern pieces using 1 seam to create shape for the bust. The larger bust method creates 6 pattern pieces with 2 seams over the bust. The draft is then traced, piece by piece, onto tracing paper. I'm making balance marks at the waist and underbust first, then drawing the outline with the same colored pencil so I can't possibly get mixed up. Before I go on, I would like to disclaim that the techniques you are about to see should not be considered proper corset making. Our purpose here is to create a mock-up that's wearable enough to test for several days and make sure it doesn't cause pain, not a neatly finished garment. Try these methods at your own risk, using materials you don't care about and the appropriate safety gear where applicable. To construct the wearable mock-up, I cut all of the pattern pieces out of a double layer of cotton twill. The left front piece, which will contain the post side of the bust, is cut on the fold. I experimented with different options to mark these out, first by sandwiching them between transfer paper, and later by tracing onto the top layer only in regular graphite pencil, using highly improvised pattern weights. This would have been fine if I had cut everything out with a consistent seam allowance, but did I? Nope! Hopefully the struggle of lining these pieces up to sew right has taught me my lesson. As usual, don't be like me. I'm using the double welt construction method from Morgan Donner's tutorial, which suggests putting the busk in first. I marked the positions of the posts on the left front, the piece I'd cut on the fold, poked through the material with an awl, widened the holes with the usual improvised tools, and popped the busk in. Yes, I am aware that the busk is slightly too long for this front piece. I'm sure I'll come up with some clever solution when I put on the binding. To keep the fabric properly aligned and tensioned as I sewed, I clipped it in place over the busk. Then I stitched around it with a narrow zipper foot, green thread for some contrast, and very short stitches. I hooked the loop side of the busk over the post, placed the right front pieces under it, and marked the position of the loops. Then I sewed the two front pieces together by lock stitching, meaning I stitched forwards, then back, then forwards again, skipping over the marked areas for the loops. Guiding the fabric with one hand while holding down the reverse button was tricky, but I figured out I could just barely reach it with my pinky. Why are tiny hands always a problem? I switched back to the pretty green contrast thread, and sewed around the outside of the busk same as before. Then began the very repetitive process of assembling the corset pieces. This technique involves sandwiching one double-layered piece between the two layers of the next one, sewing them right sides together, pressing them both over so they're wrong sides together, and repeating with the next piece. Please refer to Morgan's tutorial for a more detailed explanation of this method. I sewed, and pressed, and sewed, and pressed, and sewed and pressed until I'd assemble all 5 sets of panels. At the center back edge, I pressed both the seam allowances under and top stitched them down with the teeniest, tiniest allowance I could. White thread this time, because I didn't want to draw attention here. Here's what it looks like all assembled. For the boning channels, I simply placed either a spiral or cable tie bone on either side of each seam and sewed around it with the narrow zipper foot. This is easier said than done because on one side I had to wrangle the seam allowances around the bone. The sensible thing would have been to grade them smaller as I assembled the corset, but I didn't think of that until it was too late. I only had enough spiral boning for some of the channels, so I'm doing one spiral and one cable tie on each seam, except the back one, which just gets cable ties. The center back is getting one of each in the same channel, which I'm sure is not great, but I wanted something stiffer than the cable ties and without the sideways flexibility of spiral steel right next to the lacing. I noticed that the more I stopped to straighten everything, the more crooked and messy my stitching was. I guess the trick is to blast right through them and show them no fear. To create binding for the top and bottom edges, I cut 4 strips of my scrap twill, on the bias, each 2 inches wide. Creativity was required to fit the 4th one. I used an old hat pin to iron them into binding tape, a trick I learned when sewing masks. I find it much easier than using a tape maker. All that was left to do was preparing the boning and sewing it into the corset. I go into more details about preparing cable tie boning in my video on 18th century stays, which is linked above and in the description. It looks a lot like this. The spiral bones were a little more exciting. Don't try this at home, and don't try this without eye protection. Okay.
And bring that into about there or so.
Okay. All right.
Set that.
Am I doing the thing?
So say it's out here.
Okay. This is terrifying. So I definitely don't know how to handle the sparks coming at me. Well, that worked. This is scary.
Have a little bit more of a surgical this side, that side approach.
Let's try this again. That was more effective.
Good.
This is still terrifying.
I mean, yes.
And then he's like, she's got this, and leaves.
I am expecting you to break the blade at some point here.
Okay.
Which is a normal thing and part of the learning process of Dremels.
Okay.
I'm kind of amazed that the one that's on there has lasted as long as it has. Figured I shouldn't mention it until you were a little more comfortable with things.
Maybe I'll just cut it. That would work. There we go.
Dremels are very good at making things go gone.
The silicone tipping fluid on these guys is still a little bit squishy. I mean, what am I even saying? It's not even proper tipping fluid. It's at a cure time of 24 hours, but I'm impatient. It's been nearly 24 hours, and I want to get this thing finished today, so these are going in. Inserting the bones into the channels is fairly self-explanatory, except for the part where I didn't mark them or anything to keep track of what went where. Lessons for next time? Cutting these strips on the bias gives them a little bit of stretch, so they bend around the edges of the corset very easily. Proper corset making technique would involve basting around both edges and then sewing the binding on, but in keeping with the theme of this project, I can't be bothered. I'm skipping over the busk because the front panels were cut too short and I likewise couldn't be bothered to recut them. Using the narrow zip rivet to avoid hitting any bones, I'm sewing through all of the layers of the folded binding and corset. Another discovery I made during this project: eyelets and grommets are different. I had bought eyelets, which are only one piece, whereas grommets are two pieces and a bit sturdier. The eyelets will do fine for this. Using a ruler, I marked out the eyelet placement 1 inch apart and 1/4 inch away from the last channel. Check they line up. Then I set the eyelets with setting pliers. You do need to punch a hole first. The top ones had to be a different color, which irks me. Good thing they're in the back and I don't have to look at them. To deal with that binding situation over the busk, I just whipped the binding in place to cover the ends. This wouldn't be a very sturdy solution, but I didn't need it to be. It was much easier than recutting both front panels. Well, here we are several days after finishing this corset mock-up, and I am happy to report that my lower back does not hurt. I've worn this for at least a few hours every day during normal activities, housework, sewing, video chats with friends, and I have had none of the awful spasms that plagued me in my old corset. I've occasionally had slight tension or discomfort in my lower back, but I also have that frequently without the corset because my fibro likes to pick on certain muscle groups more than others. I would also like to note that I did this testing after having sprained my right shoulder in my sleep, because that is the sort of absurd nonsense that my body likes to do. It's taped up real well with KT tape right now, which took care of the pain in literally a few hours, but if I can wear this thing while injured and not be in pain, I'm gonna count this as a success. There are things about this corset that I'll want to fix in later mock-ups or the final thing. Firstly, I'm going to undo the change I made to the left side bust because my cup runneth over a little on that side. I think reducing all of the measurements improved the fit enough that I didn't need to reduce it more. The right one's about perfect, by the way. It's really common to be half to a full size smaller on the side that is your dominant arm, and now you know how to draft for it. I also need to completely rethink how this corset will provide shoulder support. I raised the top edge and back hoping to add support for my spine, but this has had the effect of pushing my shoulder blades forward and out of their sockets, which is exactly what my shoulders should not be doing. I could either lower the top edge in the arm size, but then I'd have no support, or I could draft out something like this, which is an original from 1890 labeled Corset with Shoulder Braces that comes all the way up in the back with straps to provide support like 18th century stays. I love the shoulder support I get from my stays, so this is probably how I'll do it. I think that's all for now. Remember to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell to stay updated on future videos, including my 2 live streams during CocoVid, and whenever I turn this pattern into a proper corset. Pop down in the comments and let me know your experiences making corsetry for your own quirks and fitting needs. For in-progress photos and other silliness, you can follow me on Instagram at Miss Snappy Dragon. I'll see you next time. Happy sewing!